My banker called me on a Tuesday afternoon at 4:12, and that alone should have told me something was wrong, because Dennis Okafor did not make phone calls. Dennis sent emails. Dennis scheduled appointments through his assistant 3 weeks out. In the 9 years I had banked at Cascade Trust, Dennis Okafor had never once dialed my number himself. I was in my garage in Tulsa, Oklahoma, sanding down an old rocking chair that had belonged to my father, and I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the extension. I picked up on the fourth ring. He said, "Walter, it's Dennis. I need to see you this week. Today, if you can manage it." I said, "What's this about?" He said, "I'd rather not get into it on the phone. Can you come by the branch at 5? There was a tightness in his voice I had heard maybe twice before in 9 years, both times when a client had lost a spouse and Dennis had to walk them through what came next. This wasn't that tone exactly, but it was a cousin of it. It was the tone of a man carrying something he didn't yet know how to put down gently. I said I'd be there. I set down the sandpaper. I checked on the tomatoes out back, because Rosalind used to say a man who can't be bothered to check his tomatoes has bigger problems than he thinks. I put on a clean shirt. I drove to the branch on Riverside Drive. Dennis didn't meet me at the teller counter. He met me at the side door and walked me straight back to his office, which told me this wasn't a routine matter before he said a single additional word. He closed the door. He sat down across from me and didn't waste time. He slid a manila folder across the desk and said, "Walter, 3 weeks ago someone opened a home equity line of credit against your property on Cherry Street. It's drawn down to just under $210,000. The paperwork has your signature on every page." I looked at the folder like it might bite me. He said, "I didn't process this myself. It came through our loan department with what looked like standard documentation. Notarized. Your driver's license, copied on file, your signature matching what we have on record closely enough that it cleared initial review. It wasn't until the disbursement schedule triggered a fraud flag on our end, large transfers to an account we didn't recognize, that anyone looked closely." I opened the folder. The first page was the loan application. My name, Walter Eugene Pruitt. My address, my social security number typed in correctly. The signature at the bottom looked close enough to mine that a stranger glancing at it would never question it. I turned the page. There was a notarized affidavit. My name, again. A notary stamp from a public notary in Broken Arrow, a town I hadn't set foot in for at least 2 years. I turned another page. A disbursement authorization. 3 separate wire transfers, 40,000 here, 60,000 there. The remainder split across 2 more transactions, all routed to an account under an entity called Prairie Ridge Holdings, LLC. I said, "Dennis, I have never applied for a home equity line in my life. I paid that house off in 2009. He said, "I know that, Walter. I pulled your full history before I called you." I said, "These dates. The notarization is from June 3rd. I looked at him. I was in Springfield, Missouri, on June 3rd. I was at my granddaughter's college graduation. There are 200 people who saw me there, and I've got the hotel receipt to prove it." He said, "I believe you." I said, "Someone forged my signature, walked it past a notary, and drained $210,000 out of my house." He said, "Yes." I said, "Who submitted this application?" Dennis pulled a second sheet from the side of his desk, the internal loan file, and read the contact name listed as the borrower's authorized point of contact. He said, "The application lists your grandson-in-law, a man named Trevor Ashcroft, as having power of attorney on file, submitted alongside the application." I set the folder down on the desk with the kind of careful stillness a man uses when he is deciding, in real time, not to let his hands do something he'll regret. I looked out Dennis's window. Riverside Drive was moving through an ordinary Tuesday evening. Cars easing toward the interstate, a woman walking a dog past the parking lot, the whole unbothered machinery of a world that had no idea what had just been said in that office. Dennis said, "Walter, I've already flagged this internally as suspected fraud. I've frozen further disbursement on the line, though most of it has already gone out. I contacted our fraud department before I called you, and I want you to know I also called the county recorder's office to confirm whether a power of attorney was actually filed, because something about the timeline didn't sit right with me." I said, "And?" He said, "There's no power of attorney on file anywhere in Tulsa County. Whatever they submitted to us was never properly recorded, if it's even real at all." He reached for his own phone and dialed an extension. He said into the receiver, "Priya, I need the complete Pruitt relationship history pulled, every account, every document, going back to when the accounts opened, formatted for legal review, today. He set the phone down and looked at me. He said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "Everything you just started, and one more thing." He said, "Name it." I said, "Don't let this get buried in some queue." He said, "Walter, I've been in banking for 22 years. I have never once let a fraud case sit in a queue, and I'm not starting with yours." I picked up the folder, thanked him, and walked out through the lobby into the evening air. And I stood on the sidewalk outside Cascade Trust for a long moment with that folder tucked under my arm, feeling the particular kind of stillness that comes right before a man decides exactly what he's going to do about something. Trevor Ashcroft had forged my signature, invented a power of attorney that existed nowhere in any recorder's office, drained $210,000 out of the house I'd paid off with 30 years of overtime shifts. And he had done every bit of it while showing up to Thanksgiving dinner asking whether my hip was giving me trouble on the stairs. I did not feel rage standing on that sidewalk, and I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters to how the rest of this went. What I felt was something colder and more organized than rage. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer before I retired, and there's a particular kind of clarity that comes over you when you've spent 3 decades identifying exactly where a load-bearing failure is going to occur before it happens. I felt that same clarity settle into me right there on the sidewalk. I knew precisely what I was looking at. The only open question was how fast I could get the right people in the right places before Trevor realized I was already 3 steps ahead of him. My name is Walter Pruitt. I am 67 years old. I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the man who forged that paperwork had made exactly one catastrophic error in judgment. He assumed that a widower who spent his career pouring concrete and calculating load tolerances wouldn't notice a crack in a foundation until the whole structure came down around him. What he'd actually been circling for the better part of 2 years was a man who had spent his entire working life trained to spot exactly this kind of failure before it ever reached the surface. He had 3 weeks before the whole thing came apart under him, and he had no idea the clock had already started. I built my career at Halverson and Doyle Structural Engineering, starting as a junior draftsman in 1979 and retiring as senior partner in 2018. 39 years of inspecting bridges, reviewing blueprints, and signing off on load calculations where a decimal point in the wrong place could mean a building came down on people's heads. You don't survive 4 decades in that business without becoming the kind of man who documents everything, because in my field, a lawsuit can arrive 15 years after a project closes, and the only thing standing between you and ruin is a filing cabinet full of calculations, signed inspection reports, and dated correspondence. I brought that habit home with me. Rosalind used to tease me about it, said I kept receipts for things that hadn't even happened yet. Rosalind Marie Pruitt, born Rosalind Marie Kowalczyk in Muskogee in 1955, taught 4th grade for 29 years and had the rare gift of being both exacting and endlessly warm, sometimes in the same sentence. She kept a small spiral notebook in the junk drawer by the phone, where she wrote down things she wanted to remember: a grandchild's joke, a bird she'd spotted on the feeder, a line from a book she loved. She was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in early 2020 and passed in the fall of that year, in the bedroom we'd shared for 38 years, with both our children beside her. I still keep her notebook in that same drawer. I've read it more times than I'll admit to anyone. We had 2 children. Marcus was 46, an orthopedic surgeon in Denver who called every Sunday without fail and flew in twice that first winter after Rosalind passed, without me having to ask. Carrie Ann was 43, lived 20 minutes from me in Broken Arrow with her husband Jason and their 2 kids, and their oldest daughter, my granddaughter Emily, had married a man named Trevor Ashcroft 2 years earlier. Trevor was 34, worked as a mortgage broker at a firm out in South Tulsa, and had the kind of easy charm that made him popular at every family gathering, remembered everyone's birthday, told a good story, laughed at the right moments. I'd known within the first year of meeting him that he was a man who kept mental ledgers on people, tallying up what they had and what it might someday be worth to him, not in some cartoonish villain way, but in the quiet, structural way a certain kind of person just moves through the world. Rosalind, in the last year of her life, had said it to me plainly one evening while she sat up in bed with her notebook. She said, "Walter, that boy is always running numbers." I told her I knew exactly what she meant. She said she knew I did. The early years of Emily and Trevor's marriage looked ordinary enough on the surface. They bought a starter home in Bixby. They came to every holiday. Trevor was reliably warm, asked good questions, Remembered details about my old projects that most people's eyes glazed over hearing about. What I logged quietly, without acting on it, began about a year after Rosalind died. Questions about whether I'd updated my estate documents. Comments about how much the Cherry Street house must be worth now, given how the neighborhood had come up. An offer, framed as a favor, to help me refinance and free up some cash for my retirement, since I was, in his words, sitting on a lot of equity doing nothing for me. I was walking 2 miles most mornings along the river trail. My doctor had called my last physical the healthiest he'd seen from a man my age in years. I understood in the moment Trevor made that offer that it wasn't coming from concern. What I hadn't yet understood was how far he'd already decided to take it without me. I found out exactly how far the Tuesday Dennis Okafor called at 4:12 in the afternoon. I drove straight from the bank, not home, not to call Carrie Ann, but to the office of an attorney named Priscilla Vance, who specialized in elder financial fraud and had an office above a hardware store on Cincinnati Avenue that had been there since before I was born. I'd been given her name 3 years earlier by my estate attorney, back when I'd asked, almost as an offhand question, whether he knew anyone who handled this kind of thing. He'd said, "There's exactly one person in this city you want, if it ever comes to that. Her name's Priscilla Vance, and she doesn't do consultations by appointment. You just show up and she'll see you." I'd filed that name away the way I filed most things, in a place I could find it exactly when I needed it. Priscilla Vance was somewhere in her 50s, compact, plain-spoken, the kind of woman who didn't waste a single word or a single motion. Her office had a whiteboard with 3 ongoing cases mapped out in different colors. She was on the phone when I walked in. She held up one finger, wrapped the call in under a minute, and said, "Sit. Tell me what happened." I sat down. I put the folder on her desk. I said, "My granddaughter's husband forged my signature on a home equity loan against my house and walked off with $210,000 using a power of attorney that doesn't exist in any county record." She looked at the folder without touching it yet. She said, "How do you know it doesn't exist?" I said, "Because my banker called the county recorder himself before he called me, and there's nothing filed anywhere." She said, "And you have proof of where you actually were on the date this was notarized?" I said, "June 3rd, I was in Springfield, Missouri at my granddaughter's college graduation. I've got the hotel folio, the gas receipts, and about 200 witnesses, including the dean of the nursing school, who shook my hand." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "What did you do for a living, Mr. Pruitt?" I said, "Structural engineer, 39 years." She said, "That explains the receipts." She pulled the folder toward her and read through it in total silence for close to 2 minutes, turning pages with the unhurried, deliberate pace of someone who reads fraudulent paperwork for a living. She closed the folder. She said, "This is elder financial exploitation under Oklahoma law, and depending on how the forgery and the fraudulent notarization shake out, we could be looking at multiple felony counts: forgery, exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and possibly notary fraud if that stamp turns out to be as fake as it looks." I said, "I know." She said, "How do you want to proceed?" I said, "I want that loan reversed and that lien pulled off my house. I want Trevor Ashcroft's name attached to a criminal record that follows him the rest of his working life. And I want to be in whatever room it happens in when he finds out I was already 3 steps ahead of him." She was quiet a moment, then said, "Those are all achievable." She picked up her pen. She said, "Start from the beginning. Don't skip anything you think doesn't matter. Let me be the judge of that. Act." I talked for the better part of an hour. She wrote the entire time without interrupting once. When I finished, she asked 3 questions. Had Trevor ever had legitimate authorization on any of my accounts? No. My son Marcus was named on every account as successor and had been since Rosalind passed. Did my granddaughter Emily know what her husband had done? I said I honestly didn't know, and I wanted to find out for myself before assuming anything. Did I have any record of the conversations where Trevor had raised the idea of refinancing? I said, I keep a engineer's notebook out of habit, dated entries, every substantive conversation, going back to right after Rosalind died. Priscilla set her pen down. She said, "Mr. Pruitt, I've handled around 40 of these cases in this county. Maybe 5 clients have ever walked in here with documentation like what you just described." I said, 39 years signing off on load calculations. You don't survive that business without becoming a man who writes everything down. She almost smiled. She said, "Let me tell you exactly what we're going to do." The first call Priscilla made, right there with me, sitting across from her, was to Cascade Trust's legal department, to formally put them on notice of pending litigation, and to demand the lien be suspended pending investigation, which changed the whole posture of the situation overnight. The second call was to a private investigator named Ruth-Ann Sokol, who worked out of a converted warehouse space near the old rail yards, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and cared exclusively about what was actually true rather than what anybody wanted to hear. She called Priscilla back 4 days later with what she'd found, and it wasn't a crime of impulse. It was an architecture. Trevor had spent the better part of 18 months researching Oklahoma power of attorney requirements, found a document mill operating out of a strip mall in Broken Arrow that produced convincing but entirely bogus notarized forms, and built a paper trail of interactions with a notary that had never actually taken place. He'd lifted my actual signature from an old warranty deed on file at the county assessor's office, a public record he'd had every legal right to view and no legal right to trace onto anything else. He had used a public document tied to the house I'd built a life in to steal the signature that unlocked its equity. Ruth-Ann also found that Trevor had opened a business checking account 3 months earlier under an entity called Ashcroft Family Holdings LLC, registered that same spring, purpose listed as Family Asset Management Services. No clients, no revenue, nothing moving through it. An empty structure sitting there, built and waiting to receive something that hadn't arrived yet. Priscilla stared at that filing for a long moment. She said, "He built the receiving end before he built the fraud. He was that confident you wouldn't catch it." I said, "He'd known me 6 years." She said, "He saw what he expected to see. A widower in his 60s, alone in a big old house, easy to manage." I said, "My wife told me he was always running numbers." She said, "She wasn't wrong. He just had the wrong inputs." Then there was Emily. I have to talk about that phone call separately, because out of everything, it cost me the most, and I've turned it over in my head more than any other part of this. I called her on a Wednesday evening, 9 days before the date Priscilla told me we needed to have this settled before it went further. I told her to listen all the way through before she said a word. Then I told her everything. The folder, the forged deed of trust, the fake power of attorney, the shell company with nothing in it. When I finished, there was a silence on the line long enough that I checked twice to see if the call had dropped. She said, "Grandpa, I didn't know about any loan. I swear I didn't know he'd done that." I said, "What did you know?" She said, "He told me he'd set something up to help you, some kind of home equity thing. Said older folks sometimes need help managing a house that big alone. Said you'd probably be stubborn about it at first, and that I shouldn't worry about the paperwork because it was mostly boilerplate." I sat with that a long moment. Mostly boilerplate. The exact language a man uses when he needs his wife agreeable without being informed. I said, "Are you going to stand behind what he did? Or are you going to tell the whole truth?" A long pause. The sound of somebody working through something about her own life she'd been avoiding looking at directly. She said, "I'll tell the truth. All of it. Whatever it costs." I said, "Meet with my attorney tomorrow morning. 2. Bring anything in writing. Texts, emails, all of it." She said, "I have texts, Grandpa. A lot of them." I said, "I know, Emily, and none of this changes how I feel about you. But what Trevor did is a crime, and what you do in the next 2 weeks matters a great deal for what happens after," she said quietly. "I know." Near the end, she said, "I should have asked more questions." I said, "Start asking them now." Priscilla met with Emily the next morning and called me that afternoon. 61 text messages spanning nearly a year, showing Emily had believed there was some kind of legitimate refinancing arrangement and had no idea any of the documentation was forged. She'd been misled by her own husband, plainly and provably. Priscilla also told me she'd filed a formal fraud complaint with the Tulsa County District Attorney's Office, on top of the notary fraud referral already going to the state. She asked if I was ready. I told her I'd been ready since I was standing on the sidewalk outside that bank with the folder under my arm. My son Marcus flew in from Denver 2 days before the meeting Priscilla had arranged with the bank's fraud team and the DA's investigator, without me asking him to. He called at 6 that morning and said he was already at the airport. We sat at my kitchen table that night and I told him everything from the beginning. He listened the way his mother used to, completely, without interrupting once. When I finished, he looked at the table for a while and said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I'm functioning." He said, "Not the same thing." I said, "No, it isn't." "Okay, comes after this," he said. "Mom always said you were better at taking care of everybody else than yourself," I said. She was right about most things. We talked past midnight. I lay awake afterward, not afraid, just wide awake in the particular way a man gets the night before something important, aware of every sound in the house. I thought about Rosalind's notebook in the kitchen drawer. I thought about 39 years of documentation and what it means to keep habits that outlast the reasons you started them. Eventually, I slept. The meeting took place on a Friday morning at the district attorney's office downtown, an unremarkable beige conference room with fluorescent lights and the particular hum of a building that processes serious things every single day without slowing down. Priscilla met me in the hallway at 8:45. Marcus stood beside me. Dennis Okafor came in person because Priscilla had asked him to, and he'd said yes without hesitation. At 9 sharp, Trevor arrived with an attorney, a heavy-set man named Roland Ferris with the look of someone expecting a routine, low-stakes conversation. Trevor wore a good suit, hair combed, the full composed presentation of a man who still believed he'd talk his way out of whatever this was. He saw me in the hallway and something in his face recalibrated fast before he caught it. He said, "Walter, I didn't realize you'd be here yourself." I said, "It's my house and my signature." "Trevor, where else would I be?" He said, "I hope you know this whole thing has just been a misunderstanding." I said, "I know exactly what this has been." His attorney touched his elbow and they moved toward the conference room. The lead investigator, a woman named Detective Alana Marsh, who'd worked financial crimes for 11 years and had the patience of someone who'd stopped being surprised by families a long time ago, opened the meeting by laying out what her office had already confirmed independently. No power of attorney, on file, anywhere in the county. A notary stamp traced back to a notary commission that had actually expired 8 months before the date on the document, and bank records tying the dispersed funds directly into the Ashcroft family holdings account within 72 hours of each transfer. She looked at Trevor and asked him directly whether he was aware that knowingly submitting forged financial documents to a lending institution was a felony under Oklahoma law. Roland Ferris started to answer for him. Detective Marsh said, quite evenly, that she'd asked Mr. Ashcroft, not his attorney. Trevor's composure, which had held steady in the hallway, came apart in real time in a way I recognized instantly. 39 years of engineering teaches you exactly what it looks like when a structure that seemed stable suddenly reveals it never was. The precise moment a load-bearing assumption collapses under actual weight. I'd watched it happen in inspection reports and arbitration rooms more times than I could count. What I watched on Trevor's face in that conference room was a man realizing, in real time, that everything he'd built over 2 years had failed completely, not partially. He said, "I can explain the timeline." Detective Marsh said, "I'd like you to, on the record, with your attorney present." Roland Ferris asked for a moment to confer privately with his client. Priscilla leaned toward me and said quietly, "That's exactly the moment you wanted to see." Marcus stood beside me and put a hand briefly on my shoulder, which was exactly the right thing and the only thing that needed saying. Across the table, Trevor sat very still, the suit and the haircut and the composure all still technically arranged and meaning nothing at all now. He glanced up once, not deliberately at me, just the involuntary way a person looks around when they're trying to reassemble a version of the world that had just come apart under them. Our eyes met for a second. I didn't look away. I didn't say a word. I just watched him with the expression of a man who'd calculated this exact outcome 2 weeks earlier and found the numbers landing precisely where he'd expected them to. Formal charges were filed against Trevor 6 weeks later: forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and fraud against a lending institution, along with a separate referral to the State Notary Commission regarding the fraudulent stamp. He no longer works in mortgage lending. His firm terminated him within a week of the charges becoming public. Cascade Trust reversed the entire home equity line and released the lien on the Cherry Street property once their internal fraud review confirmed everything Priscilla's investigator had already found. Emily filed for divorce that same month. She brought her phone records to Priscilla's office voluntarily and answered every question the DA's office asked her, in full, without hedging. She's my granddaughter, and I've made my peace with the difference between being deceived and choosing not to look too closely. And where Emily sits on that line is a distinction I've chosen to make in her favor. She and her daughter live in a rental near Carrie Ann now. She comes to Sunday dinner every week. She asks a lot more questions these days than she used to. Carrie Ann drove over for the first Sunday dinner Emily came to after everything settled, And the three of us sat around my kitchen table for the first time in longer than I could remember without that quiet undercurrent of tension running beneath everything. Emily looked at her plate for a while and then said, "Grandpa, did Grandma know? About Trevor, I mean, before any of this." "Emily," I said, "your grandmother knew things a long time before most people ever caught up to them." She said, "What did she know?" I said, "She knew he was always running numbers. She just understood exactly what kind of numbers they were." Emily was quiet a moment, then said, "I should have asked her more when I had the chance." I said, "Ask them of me, instead, from here on." Rosalind's notebook is still in the kitchen drawer. I haven't moved it. The bird feeder out back still gets filled every Sunday morning with the same mix she used to buy from the feed store on 71st Street, and the Cardinals still show up right around 8 like they know the schedule better than I do. The Cherry Street house is held in the Rosalind and Walter Pruitt Family Trust now, with Marcus as trustee, and every account, every deed, every document, exactly where I said it would be, and exactly where anyone would need to find it. I'm 67 years old. I still walk the river trail most mornings. I keep an engineer's notebook with a dated entry for every conversation that matters, and I could hand any auditor in this country a filing system they could make sense of inside of 20 minutes. Whatever those forged documents claimed about who I am, there's now a criminal case on record proving exactly the opposite. That's the only record that actually counts. My own father used to say a man is measured by what he builds and what he's willing to stand in front of to protect it. He drove a delivery route in Muskogee for 34 years and never once let anybody walk off with something that was his to guard. I picked that up from him the same quiet way I picked up most things that ended up mattering. I built something over a long working life. Somebody tried to take it out from under me while shaking my hand at Thanksgiving. I held onto it with 39 years of paperwork, one attorney who didn't waste a single word, and a banker who picked up the phone himself instead of letting it sit in somebody's inbox. That's the only inheritance worth talking about.